Good afternoon and welcome to our BSI IFE webinar series, where today we'll be exploring the evolving landscape of fire risk assessment. For those of us that haven't met before, my name is Ant Bird and I'm Director of Built Environment here at BSI Standards, and it is my pleasure to be your chair for this afternoon's session. We have another great lineup of speakers for you today, but more of that in a moment. Firstly, let's just do some housekeeping. Next slide, please, Andrew. You've probably joined us before at one of these events, but just as a gentle reminder, this is a lesson-only webinar, but it is being recorded, okay? So people can pick it up and share it after the event. We really welcome your questions via the Q&A function, which will be answered after the presentations. We've subtly changed the timing this time of this particular webinar. We've extended it by 15 minutes, so we have up to an hour and 15 minutes to make sure we can really work through all the questions that you have for our speakers today. It's fair to say we've got a good selection of questions that have come in prior to the event, but please send your questions in. They'll pop up on my screen and we can put them to our two speakers. As it says there, simply click on the Q&A button in the side panel and post your questions, so do keep them coming. By the same token, if you experience any technical difficulties, then please submit your issue again by the same Q&A function as well. Really important that we keep you on track and keep you involved with today's webinar. As per normal, upon completion of the feedback survey, and we really do need your survey, BSI will send you a link to the recording of the webinar, which you can pick up and utilise later. You can share with colleagues, you can rewatch, etc. So please do that as part of the feedback survey. And similar to asking questions, we really value your feedback. The way we can hopefully bring you content that you want to come and join us to listen to is by you suggesting some of the things and subjects that you'd like us to explore. We do consider everything that comes back, and we find it, as I say, really invaluable. And of course, something very close to my heart as well, this is a CPD recognised webinar. Please request your certificate via the same feedback survey after the webinar, and we'll get that certificate out to you as well. So, right, next slide, please. Let's get on with today's webinar. As I say, we have two great speakers joining us today. We have Ian Bailey, Technical Advisor to the IFE, and my BSI colleague, Chris Smith-Wong. We're going to run the presentations back to back. So after I introduce both Ian and then Chris, Ian will present and then hand seamlessly over to Chris. And then after Chris is completed, we'll move into a joint Q&A where all three of us will return and we'll take all of your questions. So as I say, we have Ian before us today. Ian has worked in the fire sector for over 30 years. I know it's hard to believe looking at that picture, much better than mine. Much of this time was spent in the fire and rescue service, but he also specialised in the fire safety field early on in his career. Ian has a wide range of experience in the sector with particular interest around evac lifts, smoke control systems design, CFD design, heritage premises and salvage plan design, picking up also firefighting tactics and systems, firefighting lifts, something very relevant at the moment with the new ADB coming forward, enforcement and legislation and planning, and building control consultations. But what keeps him most busy in the day job at the moment, as I say, he's a fire engineer by background, and Ian heads up the role of IFE's UK government liaison and leads the institution's work with the Home Office, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, DLUC, and now, of course, the Building Safety Regulator. So that will be Ian, and he'll be running our first presentation. Ian will then hand over to Chris for the second part. Chris is a lead standards development manager here within BSI's built environment sector, specialising in fire safety engineering, and alarm and detection systems. Chris joined the built environment sector in 2014 and has managed committees in a multitude of areas. I'm very lucky we are to have him too. That's our two great speakers. Let's start with Ian. Ian, over to you, sir.
Hello all. It's really good to be here, and I'm really pleased to get an invite from the BSI to have a conversation about this. For further context on the position I sit in at the moment, I sit on the BS 8674, which is the Fire Risk Assessor's Competence Code of Practice it's going to be. So that's in drafting at the moment, and that's fundamentally the final goal we're aiming for here. also sit on the Fire Risk Assessors Competence Working Group, as well as Ant mentioned, is now a project board, and represent the IFE and our members there. We've also had other team members taking up branches of the work, because as you can imagine, this is quite a detailed piece of work that we're doing, and we're developing more branches within it, so you'll see as we go along. There are no big secrets going to come out here. That, you know, there's some detail that hasn't yet been finalised, some that's got to be consulted on and drafted still. But what I will try and give you is a clear direction of where we're heading with as much detail as I can, and just so that you can be prepared for any changes to come going forward. Thank you. Next slide, please. So clearly, Grenfell has been the primary catalyst for a lot of change in the industry at the moment. And out of that came the Judith Hackett review of the building regulations. What she found was, which is relevant to us here, is the fundamental approach to fire safety was problematic. There's critical roles, such as the fire risk assessor role, was found to be fragmented, lacking coherence, and also anecdotally, we're still seeing, you know, multiple examples of fatal fires and inadequate fire risk assessments found to be a significant contributory factor. So it was clear from the review that the industry needed to change, and one of the actions out of that was the Building Safety Act. So this is fundamental to where we're coming from now. But what I'll give some examples of within that act, which are quite important to remember, is that we've got the Building Safety Regulator was established. That's a really important body for higher risk residential buildings and also for planning stages as well. The Section 11 Residence Panel, that was another of Jane Judith's findings, which was about engaging residents with you know, their buildings and the risks in the buildings. There's clear definitions now on what a higher risk building is in terms of heights, floors, etc., and that's in Section 3165. Also, just recently, the building control profession is now under regulation as well from the BSR, so that's a regulated profession now under that Section 42. That's an important thing to remember as well. But this is the bit which we're going to be focused on, which is Section 156, which is the amendments to the Fire Safety Order. So next slide, please. So the Building Safety Act, Section 1564, is one of the last to be implemented. It's not yet been implemented. It's the only one which hasn't yet. And the reason being for that is that we need industry to be ready for this. So fundamentally what it says is the responsible person must not appoint a person to assist them without making or reviewing an assessment under Article 9 unless that person is competent. So your fire risk assessor must be competent to do so. And how we determine that competence is fundamentally what we've been working on over the last few years, is a system which will do that for us. So the outcome of that is what, next slide please. The outcome of that is there was working group 4 was set up, and before we can implement Section 156 we need to have industry ready, including all of the structures and the accrediting bodies such as the IFE Fire Risk Assessors Register and others in place ready for this system. So initially what happened was working group 4 was set up after the Hackett review and Grenfell, and this was a key body to establishing competence across many sectors, including fire engineers, fire risk assessors, installers of fire stopping, etc., etc. And so the working group for fire risk assessors was set up, led by the Fire Sector Federation and the Home Office, and this working group has developed a range of pieces of work over the past couple of years. These are examples, the benchmark standard, which I'll come to in a bit later. This is a fire risk assessors benchmark standard. Also, the Fire Sector Federation and the group have established scheme and industry engagement process, which is something that's going on at the moment. I can't remember the dates, but they are engaging sector as well. Fundamental principles of risk is going to be something along the line of a three-tiered approach to both risk and competence, which I'll explain a little bit more later. Also that our BS 8674 code of practice is to be established, and that's going forward now into drafting stages. And the minimum standards for schemes, such as the IFE Fire Risk Assessor scheme, so we're putting together with the group the minimum standards required of the scheme, and that is going to be UCAS accredited as well. So the schemes must be UCAS accredited. So we've established a range of fundamental requirements out of the working group, alongside a lot of other background work and detail, which we're looking into now. Next slide, please. So the benchmark standard, this is the approved code of practice. This was the initial document that was drafted, and the Fire Sector Federation authored this with the group. And the code, what it does, it's a code that seeks to consolidate a lot of fire industry recommendations, this fragmented system we had out there, on best practice on how to assess the competency of individuals who conduct fire risk assessments. And this forms the beginnings of the process that we're coming to now. Next slide, please. So after that, there was a document written as the BSI, the British Standard, which is BSI Flex, which is part of the at the beginning is it's a foundation document to the British Standard 8670 series. What it does, it also defines the core criteria to be contextualized within each specific sector. So we, I believe, are the first to be drafting in a contextualized system in the 8674 for fire risk assessors. So we're using these two background documents as to inform us, and there's some interesting reading in this if you have a look through it around risk and how it formulates risk and in buildings. It's always a contentious issue, sort of, what is high risk in a building? Is it height? Is it flats? Is it sleeping? Is it processes? Things like that, and that's part of the problem. We have to decide, and fundamentally at one point or other we're going to have to say, okay, this is high risk and this is low risk, and we'll work with that accordingly. So that's what a lot of this next document will determine. If you could have the next slide, please. So now this is a really fundamental document. I can't emphasize enough how important it is, and if you haven't read it, it's really worth reading if you're interested in fire risk assessor competence. It's going to be fundamental to the development of the British Standard as it's going forward. It builds on the approved code of practice, Fire Sector Federation approved code of practice. It establishes the three distinct tiers, as well as acknowledging there's areas outside of that. So there's advanced areas which are beyond the scope of normal competence, such as oil producing, nuclear, things like that. And it also expresses an area below and I think the Home Office are still keen to have the ability for very, very simple premises to be not requiring a professional fire risk assessor. That's not yet to be 100% determined, but this, the fundamentals of it is that there's a core of fire risk assessments in all buildings, which will be low, medium, and high, and accordingly, we'll have a foundation risk assessor carrying out the low risk premises, intermediate, medium, advanced, the higher risk premises, and within that code of practice, there's also a range of knowledge, skills, behaviours, and one more, yes, experience. There you go. That people will be required to demonstrate going forward, and that will be part of an assessment process, which will be carried out by the accrediting the scheme bodies such as the IFE, who will be doing an assessment of the fire risk assessors' performance in all those three areas. So currently, the IFE's fire risk assessor aligns well with the benchmark standard. We're confident in its current stand, but it still needs, will need to go forward. Once we have the final standard set up, we'll obviously modify our system to accordingly, and UCAS accreditation will be required on top of that. At the moment, we're asking for Eng Tech as a minimum to come onto our register, and that brings with it, lots of positives in that it's not an easy level to get to. There's engineering elements to an Eng Tech level, and it gives us the confidence we need to have in the quality of our fire risk assessors on that register. So we're really pleased that we're sort of holding that line at this point, and we'll review that as we go forward. But I believe Eng Tech will be a minimum requirement for the mid-range to the higher tier of fire risk assessors with the IFE. That said, like I said, there's a lot of development to go, and over the coming few years we will respond to as phases of the British standard are implemented. So next slide, please. So this is the British standard BS 8674. It's going to be the built environment framework for competent of an individual risk assessors specification. So it's going to be a code of practice where it builds very much on the three documents I've previously quoted: the approved code of practice, the BSI Flex. It's fundamentally in that series, obviously, but also the benchmark standard is going to be very much an area where we think we've done most of the work to develop what we need to see from a fire risk assessor. It's just needing to be drafted into the British standard context, and with that code of practice in place. Fundamentally, it will be to establish the risk assessor's skills, knowledge, behaviours, experience. So, and within that, there's behaviours. You're going to be looking at people's ethics and things like that. The experience levels, that's still to be worked on, and how we manage the experienced worker route. It was also got knowledge, so that's qualifications and how they come about those qualifications, and obviously skills is how they apply that knowledge and experience and behaviours in the real world as well. So there's a whole range of areas that need to be assessed. Next slide, please. So what happened after the working group 4 developed where we're going? We've got to a point we're now moving on to a more project-led system. So we've converted the working group 4 and expanded it into a more project-led system, again led by the Fire Sector Federation Home Office. And we're going forward in an implementation phase now. We're looking at regulated qualifications and how that looks with regards to, what qualifications should you have regarding if you're going to be a fire risk assessor, and how do we map those qualifications, or ones which don't fully cross map with the knowledge, skills and behaviours we're expecting. Experienced workers, we've got loads of very skilled and experienced workers out there that may not have the evidence behind them necessarily of some of the bits we're asking for, and how do we accommodate them and then bring any gap in their skills, knowledge and behaviours up to speed in order for us to be able to put them on a register. We're also very, very interested in career pathways in the field. We've often had a field of fire risk assessors, ex-firefighters and etc., coming to the end of their careers and going into fire risk assessment, and we're very much seeing that as is not going to be happening so often, and we want to see this as a career for people. We very much see this as an important part of building careers, so apprenticeships are being looked at as well. We're also drafting the British Standard. I mentioned that before. We've got an eye on Grenfell Phase 2 and what that says in that September 4th, I believe, that's coming out. So there's going to be certainly going to see some tweaks or even some radical changes from that, I expect, to the process. So that's still being kept a very close eye on. Then we've got how do we implement this? So obviously, there's no intent to just drop this in the industry and say tomorrow you have to be XYZ, qualified risk assessor. So there's going to be a determination of which premises go into the first phase of this, where the Section 156 will come into place, and that'll mean there'll be a legislative requirement on the responsible person to employ an accredited fire risk assessor, and where that accreditation will sit will be on one of these registers, having completed the assessment process by either the IFE or other accrediting bodies. So that's important to determine the premises types. That's nearly there. We think we know roughly where we're going with that, but I can't discuss that just yet until that's confirmed by the Home Office. The risk level, I don't think it's going to be any secret that higher risk buildings are going to go first in this. So wherever the higher risk buildings are, it's clearly the first priority is to go and establish Section 156 for these higher risk buildings. So that's still to go. And what the lead-in time for that looks like is where we're looking at the 8674 being finished sometime in mid-2025, ready to go. So after that, it's a discussion about how long we give a lead-in for compliance with that, or the benchmark standard is, like I said earlier, you could really read through that, and that may well be used before the 8674 comes through as the process behind which the accrediting bodies might build. So that I can't sort of say exactly how long that lead-in time will be at this stage, but we're hoping to be getting moving on the higher risk as soon as possible. And I think next slide, please. Yeah. So just to be clear and lead into our next speaker, it's Chris. This is a competence of fire risk assessors process. It's not a process about how to carry out a fire risk assessment. So Chris will be going into these details, but it's also worth briefly mentioning the PAS 79. The IFE are still supporting both PASs as valid methodologies at this stage until the new British Standard 9792 is finalised. We know there's controversial gaps, but they're still a good methodology at this stage. And it's also worth noting the purpose-built Brockler-Fratz guide is nearly complete with comment resolution. We've been sitting through that, trying to get it through as rapidly as possible. It may be slightly delayed due to PERDA and the Home Office, but we don't expect it to be significantly delayed in this process. We're very nearly there with that. So that'll be a document which will be very useful for risk assessors and responsible persons coming through. So to expand further on that, thank you. The next slide is Chris, and I'll hand over to Chris, if that's okay.
Thank you, Ian. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm the Committee Manager for FSH 14, Fire Precautions Buildings, the technical committee with overall responsibility for BS 9792. Next slide, please. So, to give you a high-level overview of the current situation, PAS 9792 is intended as a full successor to the PAS 7092, where the starting point was to take the text of PAS 792, take into consideration all of the concern that was raised post-publication, as well as the comments that were submitted during its development and public consultation, and review it under a new drafting panel under the authority of FSH 14. And that panel has all new members, and that's not a reflection upon the steering group of the original PAS 792. It's merely a recognition of the concern that was expressed, and to make sure that we get a fresh pair of eyes looking at it and coming to maybe the same decision, maybe slightly different decisions. But it was a way of ensuring that the BS was as robust as it possibly could be. It was where high level of interest. There was over 500 comments during DPC. That's the draft for public consultation, which ran. That is a sign not only of the high level of interest on this particular document, but across all British standards around fire at the time and since Grenfell, certainly. And the part of the process now is comment resolution, where we take the draft text that was issued for consultation, and the only changes that are now made are ones that have been requested from a comment received at DPC or are required because a comment has been accepted elsewhere. So we might change a line in one clause and it has a knock-on effect. All of this means that the text is still very much a draft, including all of the quotes that I've included in this presentation. Now, the majority of it should remain the same, but I would be wrong to suggest that there isn't a possibility it could change between now and publication. So please bear that in mind. What you're seeing is a snapshot in time and nothing is final. Next slide, please. So what should 9792 be used for? The scope states that it is applicable to houses and multiple occupation, blocks of flats or maisonettes, both purpose-built and buildings converted to flats, specialised housing, student accommodation falling into any of the above three categories, and those areas that provide access to residential accommodation in mixed-use buildings. It is not applicable to private dwellings or premises used solely for short-term letting, the non-domestic premises or residential care homes. For those areas, you still use PAS 79 Part 1. It may be that PAS 79.1 becomes a British standard in the fullness of time, but we haven't got any plans to do so yet. For the foreseeable future, PAS 79.1 is still appropriate. Next slide, please. BS 9792 does not apply to premises during the construction phase before the building is used as housing, but it is applicable to vacant premises, so areas that have already been constructed and are just empty for whatever reason. Particular interest, while the methodology in the BS will touch upon and address external walls, you need to use PAS 9980 to determine the fire risk of the external construction. So the BS 9792 does not replace the PAS, and I understand that thought is being given to a review and possible revision of the PAS, which Ant can discuss later on. And finally, most importantly, the methodology in 9792 isn't intended to address protection of property, either the premises or the physical contents or the environment, or protection of businesses against interruption. It is solely for the preservation of human life. Next slide, please. So what is the ultimate objective to 9792? Well, it's to maintain and improve fire safety for all occupants. And this is going to be done by providing a framework for the assessment of fire risk and a benchmark for suitable and sufficient FRA. So an FRA can go above and beyond 9792. That's absolutely fine. In fact, we actively encourage it, but it is intended to give everyone a minimum starting point to build upon. We're looking at creating a pragmatic, holistic, and risk-proportionate approach based upon a fundamental understanding of fire risk safety principles, providing and promoting a consistent approach to carrying out and documenting an FRA, presenting a methodology that can assist housing providers in meeting their legislative responsibilities, and promoting better understanding amongst housing providers and non-fire specialists of fire risks and fire safety in housing. Now, we understand that people who aren't fire specialists are reading fire standards because they come across in their day-to-day work, because they have an interest and so on. So while a British standard is never a textbook, nor is it any substitute for professional learning and expertise, where possible in the commentary, there may be some details just to provide a bit of understanding as to why a recommendation may be needed. Next slide, please. FRAs, such as the ones that 9792 will ultimately provide, do not provide a compliance audit, an access audit relating to access for disabled people, a method for identifying latent defects in construction or compartmentalization, a method for verifying the fire resistance of structural elements of the building, a method for determining the potential for structural collapse of a building or part of a building in the event of fire, a documented fire safety strategy, a means for snagging of new construction, a guide to fire safety, or a guide to legislation for the duty holder. A fire risk assessment is simply there to assess the risk of fire and the likely consequences of it. It is not a catch-all for everything else. So other assessments may still be needed. And this has been included in the commentary. It's still being debated just to provide a clarity to the user as to where an FRA, what it does cover and what it does not cover. Next slide, please. So there's been particular interest since the publication and subsequent withdrawal of PAS 79.2, led by the Grenfell inquiry, regarding the ability for those unable to self-evacuate to be rescued in case there is a fire or a need to leave. And that doesn't just apply to people with disabilities, it can also apply to people age or whatever personal circumstances need to be taken into consideration. Consideration that needs to be at the forefront of our minds as we have an increasingly diverse and aging society. So there are three definitions in the current text that I want to draw everyone's attention to. That's people with specific evacuation requirements, which is defined as people with characteristics that might require specific arrangements to support them to respond to a fire or to a fire alarm and to evacuate when necessary. Person-centered emergency plan that captures the actions to be taken in the event of a fire, tailored to the specific requirements and characteristics of an individual resident. Now that could be a personal emergency evacuation plan, a PEEP. And finally, person-centered fire risk assessment. Now this is a definition that appears quite a bit in 9792 in the draft. It is an assessment of the risk from fire focused on a specific resident, carried out with the involvement of the resident, taking into account the physical, sensory, and cognitive characteristics of the resident, together with their lifestyle and preferences. So there is not a one-size-fits-all solution. There has to be engagement. You have to understand the needs of the resident and what has to happen for their safety to be assured. Next slide, please. This means that PEEPs now only appear twice in 9792. The first is in the definition I've just read out. The second is in the pro forma section, procedures for identifying people with specific evacuation requirements, in which it simply says, e.g. a PEEP. We are moving towards person-centered fire risk assessments, which is covered in detail in clause 21. This is only the first paragraph of the commentary. The actual commentary is quite substantive, but for time, I just reduced it to this single paragraph. The vast majority of fires in housing occur in residents-owned individual accommodation. A person-centered fire risk assessment is a simple fire risk assessment process completed by duty holders with the residents, including but not limited to people with specific evacuation requirements, such as Annex D, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. To help identify fire hazards in their home and identify specific arrangements that might be needed to support them to prevent fire, respond to a fire or fire alarm operating, and to evacuate when necessary. The need to undertake a PCFRA could be identified by residents themselves, carers, family members, landlords, or any agency involved in engagement with the residents. So actually the source of the PCFRA could come from anywhere. The Clause 21 is supported by Annex D. Now, Annex D is informative. That means it doesn't have any requirements in it that must be met in order to meet the standard. It is simply there to provide additional information and context. It does contain a full list of what the drafting panel believes characteristics may need to be, may make someone eligible or require discussions about needing a PCFRA, but that is still in draft, so I haven't included it. Occupants' potential response to emergency situation and their approach to evacuation can vary greatly. This annex gives information on a range of characteristics that might be captured in PCFRA for residents of any of the buildings within the scope of the British Standard. It is not an exhaustive or comprehensive list. It has as many examples as possible, as the drafting panel thought is worth including, but users will need to be mindful in the final version that it could include other areas. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that it's a draft. So what happens now? So far, the panel has had 5 meetings, and they're considering the comments received on clause 5, with another 16 and the annexes left to go. They are, however, making really good progress. And I know BS Trouble Line 1, for example, has become the watchword for a delayed standard, but we are looking cautiously that publication will be in Q2 of next year. We aren't expecting any major delays. Obviously, if anything comes out via the Grenfell inquiry, phase 2 publication, we have plenty of time to consider that as needed. And with the new administration coming in July, we already have representatives from the Department of Levelling Up Communities and Housing and the Home Office on the panel, and we have plenty of opportunity to make sure that we are taking in the aims of the new administration and government. So when it does come close to publication date, you are going to be hearing a lot from us. We're going to do everything in our power to try and make sure everyone knows about it so it doesn't get missed. You'll be hearing more presentations like this, and we'll be looking to the organizations involved in the development of the standard to support that messaging to let know. So you will be hearing more detail, and we are looking to produce a short executive briefing to go along with publication, maybe publish it a few weeks before, that gives an overview of the standard, its development history, and some of the major headlines changes from the PAS that users now need to be aware of. You can keep up to date via our standards development portal. The link is on the screen, and you can search for BS 9792. There isn't an awful lot of information there, but if you need anything more, you can contact customer services and they'll put you in touch with me, and I will share as much as I can. But for the time being, you probably won't hear much between now and just before Christmas as we are working on the draft. Next slide, please. And that's it. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that short presentation. I hope it was useful. Back to you, Ant.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Ian, would you care to join? Thank you, buddy. And 2 excellent presentations. Thank you. Really insightful. You'll be glad to hear we've got a lot of questions in addition to those that people have sent in previously. To try and share the load between you, we've got a number around the actual risk assessment process itself that Chris touched upon, but also the rules that will ultimately follow and need to be met by our future fire risk assessors. So trying to do a bit of a blend of both of those just to start. Probably starting with you, Chris, but then hand over to Ian. Will the new BS 9792 set the minimum qualifications or standard for a person to carry out fire risk assessments?
Sure. So for a long time now, definitely since Grenfell, we've been asked that question a lot. Will standards ever actually say the minimum qualification for them to be used? The answer to that is no. It has always been seen to be outside of the remit of a standard to state explicitly what an individual should or shouldn't be able to demonstrate. The closest we will get to is the definition of a competent person, which if you want, I can read out the version for this. Uh, 9792 defines it as person with the skills, knowledge, experience, and appropriate behaviors to achieve a defined outcome. There is a note. The relevant fire safety legislation requires nomination of various competent persons to carry out a number of different defined tasks, but BSI leaves it to professional organizations like the IFE to detail the actual requirements. So Ian, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so there will be a qualification required of some sort to cover off the knowledge aspect of things, but like I said, like you say, that's going to be part of the assessment process of knowledge, skills, behaviours and experience in the scheme, which will be accredited by UCAS. There may come out a regulated qualification, however, out of this process that has been in discussion, and so training providers might be actually producing a fire risk assessor regulated qualification, which may form part of the foundation for the knowledge of to go into the scheme, but that will be built into the scheme assessment process, if that makes sense.
That's great, thank you. question here, probably more for Ian, I suggest. Given what's just been kindly presented today, what is the purpose of the Home Office Industry Engagement Group if the risk assessor standards have already been agreed?
So the group is it's not all set in stone as yet. We're still in drafting phases of the British standard. The benchmark standard is out there already, and that's established. And the 3-tier approach is pretty much established. I'd bet my house on that one. But the industry engagement group is very much more about letting people know that this is coming, being prepared. You know, as your average fire risk assessor, if you look at yourself and you match yourself to that benchmark standard and think, you know what, I'm missing this, this, and this, my advice to you would be start looking now and developing yourself so that when it comes, when this is in place, that you're ready to just put your application in and be assessed, and you'll be on the scheme. So I think the industry engagement group is got its value in that. It's not going to change huge things, I don't think, going forward. The fundamentals of this, there's a lot of detail still to be done, but like I say, it's really important that people start thinking now.
Great, thank you, Ian. Again, we've touched upon in your first presentation, Ian, you know, what good looks like. We've mentioned the Flex, which is now was republished or was published at the start of this month, actually, in its new British standard form, which people can now access. We've had a question though, is that about schemes and numbers of schemes, and so what we've been asked before us here is what is happening with the register for risk assessors, and will there be just one scheme?
So no, there'll be many different schemes who will hold a register. How we are going to combine those into a single place for a responsible person to search is still to be determined, and who would hold that. It could be, for example, the Fire Sector Federation might hold that single register, could be the Home Office, it could be the government website or something like that. So that's yet to be decided, but there's a number of other bodies out there, you know, that hold schemes, which will, so it's not going to be one scheme, but what we will be doing, we'll all be working to the same standards under UCAS and the same British standard or benchmark standard. So we'll all be doing very similar things. The only thing IFE is doing different is the engineering.
Yeah, not dissimilar to what's just happened or happening with building control at the moment. Yeah, in terms of registrations there. Okay, thank you. This is quite a specific question from Andrew, and it's in relation to the point that you made about reference to UCAS, Ian. Is there a specific reason for UCAS, as there are other approving bodies?
I think I'm not 100% au fait with UCAS, but I know very early on it was decided UCAS would be the best route for it. I'm sure there's a very good explanation, but I'm sorry, apologies, I can't answer that one very easily.
No, well, I mean, look, I bow to your expertise, but they are the UK accreditation service, so they hold a position there as well. Then obviously there are others, but I mean, again, probably something that gets flashed out and thrashed through as part of this actually progressing now anyway. Right, I mean, so just jumping around from a few more questions here, was where fire safety installations are found to be incorrect, this is as relevant now as it will be in the future, I suggest, what is an acceptable time frame to allow them to be corrected? And where costs are significant, how can corrective works be enforced?
Yeah, this is really important, actually, especially now there's a reporting process as well. It's highlighting some really problematic experiences we're seeing where, you know, it very much depends on the risk, and that's the risk assessor's job. And, you know, the first thing that probably should be done is that the responsible person should review their risk assessment, or get it reviewed with respect to that loss of fire safety equipment. If it's a smoke control system and the failure of it is such that you're going to lose your common parts, well, then that's that's serious, that needs mitigation immediately. There's no necessarily timescale, but your mitigation has to be in place as soon as possible, within hours, if not, sooner, to ensure that your residents are safe in that building, or the occupants of the building are safe. That might mean you have to change your evacuation strategy. That might mean you have to have a waking watch. It might mean you can put in place other things, but there's certain and your risk assessor should be able to help you with that risk level. If you're talking sort of more minor faults or problems, then that can be less. You've got a sticky fire door or something like that. That can be. You look at where that door is, obviously, and what risk it would present, but then you've got a maintenance period of time where, as long as you acknowledge that risk, you've got a plan in place to fix it, and that time scale is not overly long, you're covered. So it's very much about having a conversation with your risk assessor and doing the right bits around assessing that risk, so that you can justify not it still being there tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely.
That makes sense.
No, it does. Thank you, Ian. Chris, one for you from Bob. I work in the heritage sector where people sleep on the premises, such as historic families and staff. Does or will 9792 apply?
So I just had a look at the comments, responses to the comments, and I have to be careful about giving too much information, but yeah, it has been addressed, and there is going to be a degree of clarity about mixed use premises where staff is either a resident or a visitor. Just looking at the comments, yeah, so the wording still needs to be freshed out, finalized. It is possible that 9792 may be applicable, but you'll have to wait for the actual draft to come out to know for certain. And if that's not clear, then the commenter can get in contact with us, and I'll get in contact with the panel, and I'll find out exactly what was meant.
That's great, thank you, Chris. And by the same token, a question coming from Robert. Will the BS include holiday lets?
Again, that's something that we're going to clarify in the text.
No problem. You touched upon this, Ian, actually in your presentation. It's a bit of an unfair question because it's a bit of a moving feast, to say the least. But what might be the likely date for competent fire risk assessors to be registered under Section 156 of the Building Safety Act? What's your thoughts? We won't hold you to it.
Well, no, I mean, let me suggest 26 might be the full go live of a section of Section 156, perhaps the higher risk, and that would be, that's a guess. That's a see with the way the wind is going, but it gives enough time scale for notice to be given, from next year onwards, and then says right from this date will be, but you can't hold me to that, obviously. But
no, definitely not.
but yeah, I would. But don't stop now and don't wait for that to happen. This is what I'm fundamentally saying is the benchmark standard is a really good document worth looking at and worth trying to align yourself as much as possible with that. So not only is it's there now, it's a really good way of assessing your competence with regards to fire risk assessors.
Absolutely, no, definitely won't hold you to that. And again, be mindful and respected, whatever the outcome. I mean, but you can follow the polls. We will have a new government of whatever political colour after the 4th of July. They will have to bed in. They will need to understand what they have before them. And then very quickly, on the 4th of September, we'll see the publication of phase 2 of the Grenfell inquiry as well. So there's a lot to fall through. There's a lot of questions that have come forward on being cognizant of what emanates on the 4th of September from the Grenfell inquiry. Yes, when we look at the staging, the work still to be completed on a number of the standards to which we've touched upon today, there will be adequate scope to make sure that learnings, recommendations from Morbic and similar can be considered by the relevant panels and feed into those. So yeah, no, I definitely won't hold you to account on the timings. It's just, it is a moving feast. But as you say, good is out there now, some fantastic documents that you showed us, Ian, that are available now and should be utilised and suitably considered. Chris, you did touch upon this in your presentation, but just for point of clarification, the new British standard to which you took us through, does it address definitively the link between fire risk appraisals of external walls and FRAs? Could you just reiterate the point, please, Chris?
So external walls will be covered. You will need to address external walls when carrying out an FRA, but PAS 9980 is the document that is needed to determine the fire safety or the fire risk emanating from that external wall construction.
Yeah, and just, I mean, you called me out in terms of providing an update on 9980. Just to be clear, that PAS is over 2 years old now, so work has commenced, sponsored by Deluc and the Home Office, supported by the BSR as well, on the revision of 9980. There's been an initial workshop to work through learnings and understandings of the extant current version. We're now moving into a phase of draft development by our technical authors, and then we'll be seeing the formation of a new steering group to then work up and develop, again, through consensus on the steering group, a document that can go out for public consultation next year. So people will have the opportunity to tell us what doesn't work, but please also tell us what does work with PAS 9980, the extant current edition, so we can learn and our experts can consider your comments back in. So that will be forthcoming. Chris, you also touched upon, it's a really important point, certainly one I've struggled with as a former regulator and then coming in 11 years ago working in BSI, is that we write our standards for a typical audience, but we've had a couple of questions here about, and you touched upon this, what more should we be doing to educate not non-technical people in the fire field, so clients? What are you thinking about? What is the panel looking at in terms of what they're doing with 9792, please?
I think this might be something that Ian might be better answering because he'll have an industry perspective. But as a layperson, going by the feedback we receive from standards and sending committee meetings, a lot of people seem to think that standards and ADB are, well, as long as I do that, I'm all right. Well, okay, yes, but you should be really trying to go further than that. They aren't, well, we do meet ADB and I meet standards because that's what people expect, but the heart's not really in it. It's like, no, they are there to keep people alive, but you can do more than that. You can push ahead from that, and you can share the message that everybody has a role to play in fire safety, from the people who build the buildings to the people who live in them. I mean, I am a president of a block of flats, shared ownership, and I frequently have to knock on my door and tell my neighbours, you shouldn't be leaving your mobility scooter in our communal hallway, because if they go up in flames, like they do fairly frequently, we're not going to be able to evacuate. And their response is, yes, but if I don't have anywhere in my flat to put it, actually, yeah, it's a very good point. So it's a two-way conversation, but yeah, don't just think because it's in the, you've done what's in the standard, that's it, job's done.
100% agree with that.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I could build a very, very dangerous building by just using ADB and no other thought behind it. Yeah. You've got to think about how each of these pieces interlink together. No, you pick one part of the standard and you jumble it all together and you just say, yeah, I'm covered by ADB. You've still got to look at the overall risk that you're putting into the building, and it can't cover all scenarios. It doesn't cover battery energy storage systems. It doesn't really cover what you talked about, bringing scooters into your hallway and things like that, which is obviously something you don't want to be doing, especially not charging them at the moment, given the problems we're seeing. So yeah, step back, and this is what your fire risk assessor should be doing, and having a look at how this all falls together and how your building actually works rather than what it says in the standard.
Brilliant, thank you both. Chris, back to 9792. Is the new British Standard going to have some questions with yes, no, and comments like PAS 79-2? So I think it's the pro forma question.
Yes, so BS 9792 will most definitely not be a box ticking exercise where you just tell it out and that's it, job done. It will require some thought. But we are looking at reworking the pro formas, very similar to what was in PAS 792, because the copyright is held external. But we are anticipating that, at the very least, your existing pro formas from 792 will be compatible with a new version, bar one or two minor areas. Again, it's still in development, but yes, you will be getting the pro formas in some form.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Question from Bob. Based on the new requirements, probably still to be finalised, but or provisions, based on the new requirements, we have struggled to recruit fire risk assessors to work in-house. How can we overcome this shortage of skills in our sector? Ian, any broad thoughts from yourselves as the IFE?
This is where we really need to expand where we look for our skills to school leavers, colleges and universities to bring these people in. And what I would also recommend is apprenticeships and bringing people in and training them. I get that you may lose them in a couple of years' time to someone paying you more money, but at the end of the day, the industry has got to come away from hoping this retired firefighter will come in and know everything about fire safety. Well, that's not necessarily the case. You may be very good at your operations, but you might not have specialised in the fire safety areas. And so we need to develop this as a professional industry, just like building control bodies. Your fire risk assessors should be held in just as much professional regard as that. And that's what we're trying to achieve with this process. So we've definitely trying to build in the cradle to grave end of the employer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So a friend of mine who does work within the industry as well, we were discussing this literally only sort of late last week. And so for a very short duration, in its last throes, I oversaw the Fire Precautions Act 1971 in addition to ADB. And so when we saw the move from the 71 Act to the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, very much a risk-based approach. Then we saw, and again, this is an observation from outside of my roles previously, resources became an issue as well for brigades and similar. We don't have so much expertise coming out of the fire and rescue service. There are fewer people doing FP and similar. So we're going to have to crack this nut. And I completely agree that to make it a profession, a respected profession, properly rewarded, because people are suitably trained and suitably competent and are trusted, I think is really, really important going forward. So yeah, completely concur with that one. A couple more questions. These ones did come in previously because we're okay on time, and so I suggest we do carry on. We've touched upon mobility scooters and similar at the moment, and we've had an observation here, is where do I go now for more guidance relating to EV chargers, battery storage, and also solar PV? Is there anywhere you'd recommend at the moment? And then Chris, I'll ask you a follow-up about British standards in a minute, but maybe Ian, anything you'd recommend for EV chargers, battery storage and solar PV?
So these are all areas which are really under discussion at the moment. Battery energy storage, I can't remember if I think there's some guidance on the government website. I would have provided it in the links if I could remember it.
No problem.
But what you're looking at is they've changed it slightly in the domestic market under the wiring regs. So you're no longer putting them in lofts. It's not something you retrofit or change, but they're for reasons of that. And PV panels, you've got to look at what your roof is, how it was originally designed, and you're putting additional risk on that roof. So you're looking at, obviously any electrical equipment put somewhere has a fire risk involved in it. But I wouldn't be overly worried about the processes. It's somewhere we're all going to be going. It's inevitable that we need to be looking at greener energy systems, and PV is 100% one of those systems that we need to look at. Batteries is going to be another thing. In future, maybe the battery technology will be better than lithium, but at the moment, lithium is the most energy dense, the best one we've got. It has its problems. If you're using a reputable manufacturer, they're very reliable. In fact, the EVs are more reliable according to research than your petrol car. They're less likely to catch fire. But what we do have to deal with is that it's a different type of risk that we're used to. You know, you've got a garage full of petrol cars, each with, I don't know, 30 gallons of petrol in them. Now, if you picture that as a load of petrol cans in your garage, that looks quite risky. But now we've got EVs with lithium-ion batteries in them, and they produce different problems for us, as you know, if you're firefighting or the length of time they may burn for. So I think I put a link to an Arup guide around EV car parks in the links, because I think I saw this one. Someone asked a question about car parks.
Just on that, before I hand over to Chris, so just in case you're not aware, those that are joining us today, there's a handout section you can access with useful links, and Ian has very kindly put a document in there that you can link on a number of these other areas. I think, you know, from a car perspective, somebody that was involved in structural and fire design of car parks and basement car parks upon which, you know, residential buildings have sat, you know, there's a wider discussion and consideration to be had when we look at the levels of fuel load, you know, in terms of potential for electric vehicles. But I think a lot more needs to be done, and some research has been published. There's more underway, but I think this is going to be very much an international perspective as well. Chris, are you able just to touch upon where we are, no matter how nascent, in terms of considering lithium-ion fires and batteries from a standards perspective?
A bit behind the curve, I would say, if I was being fair. There is an increased awareness within SEN, for example, about determining which current extinguishers are suitable for lithium-ion fires. There is a new work item going through about a test procedure, test protocol to determine that, and the whole of Europe is throwing everything they have at it. In terms of placements, we aren't, so 991 will touch upon it. It will be for future editions, I think, to go into more detail, or perhaps 9999, because that'll be next to be revised in the future, as more knowledge and information comes to light. It is an area that standards really are going to have to react quickly to when the body of research is available, so we know what to standardize. And at the moment it is growing, but it hasn't reached that kind of critical mass place.
No, absolutely. I
think it's worth adding to that is, sorry, it's the small portable electric vehicles which are our biggest concern at the moment, and then being brought into places like flats and common parts and into your own hallways and things like that. And so if there's anything I can leave risk assessors and RPs with, is to consider how you police that and what facilities you offer, which are you know, separated from the common parts, for people to put these vehicles securely. They're not going to get stolen, maybe even let them charge them, and then you're starting to reduce the risk that people will have them in the common areas. So it's something which I'd really encourage your risk assessors and RPs to consider.
I mean, picking up a point that you've already raised, and it's a valuable one, because we still read an awful lot of cases with e-bikes and similar, where again the higher quality, the better quality batteries that come, where people have paid an awful lot of money for these bits of kit, you know, some of those are being stolen now, and of course there's a market where you can buy cheaper replacement batteries which perhaps aren't as reliable or safe. So again, it's a very similar discussion around white goods, and you know, and it's very hard when people are struggling with cost of living crisis and similar, but it is making sure that you have the requisite quality battery, again, to better protect yourself from potential fires and similar. I think we've probably gone through all of the questions. I only have one last one, if I may, and I'm mindful of the time as well. It's quite a broad question, but I think it's a very fair one, given all that we've touched upon today. Will the fire sector continue to expand in the next 5 to 10 years? Ian, did you want to have a go at this one first, fella, before I hand on?
That's a very. I'm confident it will. I mean, we've got so much to do as you know, as a sector. There's the building safety regulator. There's safety cases, which is just starting to come through. There's all of the fallout from that might be. There's the new fire risk assessors, competency. There's still a load of work to be done, and I think, like I said, I think people should recognise this is a very good career to be thinking about doing if you're leaving school or college or university. I think it's not going to go away. Fire safety is not at all. So yeah, 100%.
Chris?
Yes. Simple answer. Even the number of comments we received at public consultation before Grenfell, a couple of hundred, at most, mainly from industry. Now it's the layperson, it's organizations that maybe hadn't considered or had need to have as much of awareness of fire safety as they do now because of changes in law. The legislation itself has changed quite a lot over the years, and we've had to race to catch up. 911, for example, fell off that a few times. It's only going to, I don't want to say get worse, because I don't think increased awareness of fire safety is a bad thing. It's going to grow. I think we need more experts on our committees to participate. We need to square the circle of getting residents involved in a way that is useful for them and for us, because they will have the different expertise and experience than our other committee members. And also just raising the general level of knowledge, not only for industry professionals, but for the lay person. Again, I'm not a technical expert, I'm just a bod, but I live in a block of flats who, following Grenfell, having grown up on a council estate, is now looking at his own building and going, "Ooh, should that really be like that?" And I'm privileged, I'm in this environment, so I'm surrounded, but a lot of my neighbors aren't. So there has to be more of a sharing of information in a structured and responsible way, not, chicken licking.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a perfect sort of answer to finish on. And again, in terms of the volume of comments we now get for public consultation, whether it be for Flex, PAS or BS, I think it is a sign of the times. But at the end of the day, these are consensus-based standards, and it's imperative we get everybody's views and opinions. It makes for a lot of work. I mean, 911 is perhaps an example of that in terms of the amount of comments that came forward. But we'll get better standards at the end of it, and people will be far more aware of the importance and how they can be best used. So, no, absolutely, I completely agree. Can I just say, Ian, Chris, thank you so much. They were two excellent presentations. We're drawing to a close now, so I know how much work it takes to prepare these and bring them together. So a huge thank you from me, and I'm sure I think we had over 200 people on this webinar, so thank you. So that being the case, I will just draw this to a close, if I may. If you want to look on another slide, thank you, Andrew. I hope you will agree with me that this has been a really insightful session, that clearly there will be more to follow on the whole risk assessment landscape, and perhaps that's something that we can actually return to at a later date. In fact, I think we will. In terms of upcoming built environment webinars, it's quite timely. I promised you it wasn't laid out this way, but our next one with the IFE is on the 23rd of July, so next month. And we are looking at lithium-ion batteries, safety, the risks, the challenges, and public awareness. As Chris says, it's still quite nascent from a standards perspective, but let's just explore that. Then we've got two webinars for what we call Net Zero Week, which is in September, where we'll be looking at climate resilience of UK assets, and again, how can standardisation help in this area from our perspective, and also picking up on the latest Environmental Act, so environmental law, and where we might go with biodiversity net gain for the built environment. It's something that is on the statute books and will be forthcoming. Right, other than that, all that's left for me to say is thank you. Thank you to all of you that have joined us today to listen to our two great speakers. Thank you once again for our two speakers for giving their time. And a huge thank you to the IFE and the BSI events team as well for making this all happen. We'll see you all again very soon. In the meantime, have a good rest of the day, and hopefully, if I don't see you at the next one, a good summer as well. Take care and bye for now.
Bye-bye.